Charles Nam left Chapel Hill as soon as he had earned his master's degree in 1957. He and Marjorie moved to Washington, D.C., where he took a job at the Census Bureau. That job gave him insider access to the records of the 1950 census, and he took advantage of that access to use those census results as the raw material for his doctoral dissertation. On the advice of his doctoral advisors, he submitted some of his main results to the journal Social Forces, one of the leading sociology journals that happened to be edited also at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This paper, presenting some of his dissertation findings, appeared in Social Forces in 1959 as his first published journal article.
This article was a summary of the main part of my doctoral dissertation. However, I should add that one thing here, and that is that the Arno Press, which was putting out a series of books on race and ethnicity, decided that my dissertation would be one of the books they would like to include. And so I do have it published as a book, the dissertation as a book.
And Social Forces was a University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill house organ.
That's right. It was originally established there and maintained there, but with editors among the faculty there.
As the title of this article in Social Forces tells us, Charlie wanted to compare the social status of different ethnic groups formed by immigrants from many different countries coming to America, mainly in the half century from the 1870s until the 1920s. He had obvious personal as well as scholarly reasons for this choice of his dissertation topic.
My parents were immigrants as children from Eastern Europe, and I was very sensitive to the flow of immigrants of different nationality as they came to the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. And they were principally European nationalities. And so I thought, given the fact that I was a child of these immigrants, how much different would our social status be compared to our parents' generation?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what got me going on the dissertation.
That immigrant wave from a century ago came from many countries, mostly in Europe. As economic and social change moved gradually across Europe, roughly from northwest to southeast, different countries succeeded one another as exporters of population. Charlie captured this gradual shift in the origins of immigrants to America by comparing 5 of the earliest countries to generate streams of immigrants to 5 other countries that only got around to exporting their people to the United States after the turn of the century, just before the legal gates closed and brought the immigrant wave to an end. And you expected the old immigration countries to show different patterns than the new ones?
I expected them to show different patterns, and I expected that the second generation would improve their status over the parental generation.
For both groups.
For both groups.
For the old immigration countries that began the wave of 100 years ago, the most visible generational change between immigrants and their U.S.-born children was a shift away from blue-collar jobs, shown here as the bottom 3 blue sections of each labor force bar, in favor of an expansion, especially of the yellow segments of the bars, representing clerical and sales, white-collar work. The orange segments showing business owners and managers seems amazingly large until we remember that this category also includes the people who owned and lived on their own farms in rural areas. Interestingly, for most of these old immigrant nationalities, we do not see any big increase in the share of professions and technical careers shown in red. In fact, for the first 3 of these nationalities, the share of professionals among children of immigrants actually dropped below that seen for the immigrants themselves. People from the new immigrant countries, mostly arriving after the start of the 20th century, found themselves in a rapidly changing new social landscape. these new groups were much more likely to settle in the fast-growing new urban centers of American life. Fewer of them became farmers, and most of them had to find work in these cities, either in factories or commercial businesses. Again, the results expected by Charles Namm appear in these nationality groups, even more strongly than for the old immigrant nationalities. The generations of U.S.-born children improved their occupational standing relative to their parents. Now, for immigrants, nationality usually is easy to define. It's where they came from. How did you handle the issue that the U.S.-born generation of children of such immigrants might not always have both parents who were immigrants or from the same country?
But when it came to choosing for the second generation, where you had two parents of two different nationalities, the Census Bureau favored the father's nationality if they were
So
different.
if you're talking about a German immigrant or a child from German immigration or a child from Russian immigration, that means that for sure the father was from there,
Right.
and maybe the mother, or maybe not.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the innovations that Charles Namm introduced in this research involved calculating a summary index score for the occupations of all the working age men in each particular nationality group, and then standardizing that score to reflect the fact that some nationality groups might be more or less concentrated than the overall U.S. population in certain age groups, in rural versus urban areas, and also perhaps in different regions of the country. His results estimate what a nationality's occupation score would have been if they had the same patterns by age and place of residence as the native-born U.S. population, who themselves had native-born parents. But the index value itself was another calculation, one that Namm adapted from the work of one of his census superiors, Alba Edwards.
Well, Albert Edwards was an employee of the U.S. Census Bureau who was very interested in the socioeconomic aspects of occupations. And he went ahead and combined all of the reported occupations, the detailed occupations, into six categories based on his common sense classification of those occupations. And the six categories ranged from professional persons at the top to unskilled persons at the bottom.
These same categories have been appearing as the major categories of occupational groups ever since. Was he the godfather of occupational categories like this?
He was the godfather, but as time went on, and he was working mostly in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And subsequent census employees slightly modified what he had done.
But you make this into a scale.
I basically, in the dissertation, used the Alba Edwards approach. I consider them ordered by socioeconomic status. And then I developed an index, which was the median point for each nationality and generation.
Okay, so it's the median, not the mean.
Yes.
Now, you computed values for this scale only after standardizing for age distributions and urban versus rural residents. Did you do this separately for each of the six occupational categories or some subs?
Yes.
Yes?
And because I was standardizing for differences in age, composition, and in urban-rural residence distribution.
Within each occupational group.
Within each occupation, that accounted for a lot of standardizations to be computed.
Yes, were these the standardizations that you hammered out on your borrowed Marchant calculator in the evening and on the weekend? This is what you're talking about?
Yes.
Now, did your results shown in your table 1 of this article show what you expected to find about the new immigrant nationalities compared to the old immigrant groups?
Yes, pretty much what I had expected.
What about the comparison of foreign-born immigrants to the U.S.-born second generation in each of these nationality groups?
Well, I was using the U.S. the current U.S. pattern as a standard to compare, and in the dissertation I made that comparison as well as amongst the different nationalities.
And the U.S. born generation was doing better or not as well as their parents?
Was doing better. Yeah.
Now, you found the relative rankings of different nationalities followed the same pattern across different parts of the country, but you found striking regional differences in absolute status levels. How would you explain the unusual result that all immigrant nationalities got higher index scores in the South than in other regions after you did your standardization?
I believe that the U.S. born native population formed a lower standard in the South than in other regions. And that would have contributed or have explained pretty much. And Vance believed that as well.
So you were standardizing, and the standard was whichever batch of native born white people were living in that region,
Exactly.
and urban and rural and age groups and all the rest.
And there may, although I wasn't dealing with race in the dissertation, there may be an effect about the racial composition in the South and in other areas as well.
Yeah,
Because say the blacks in the South would have been would be lower than any of the
in
nationalities.
occupational standing at that point,
Right.
absolutely. Yes, certainly. Okay. Now, the Russian immigrants always have amazingly high status index values in your results. How did you manage to tease out some hints that this might be due to special religious ethnic features of the nationality groups? What different places did you look to find these kind of effects?
Well, the census doesn't include any data on religion, so I couldn't establish that from the census itself. But I was well aware, in fact, in my parents' case, that they were born in the Russian Empire and were Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew it to be a large proportion of the Russian immigrants were Jewish, and so and the Jews were known to have a more of a tendency to be in the upper status occupations than in the lower ones.
Now, Tomas Jimenez at Stanford has proposed that the historical pattern of upward mobility you found for these nationality groups across the generations depended partly on shutting off the flow of immigrants for several decades between the 1920s and your results at mid-century. Would you expect similar results for immigrant groups today who are still being replenished by a continuing stream of arrivals, like from Mexico or India or China?
Yeah.
Would you expect second generation to be higher than the first and the third generation to be higher than the second?
I would think so, based on their assimilation and movement toward the occupations that are higher up in the scale.
Okay, any other thoughts about this article?
Yes, as a matter of fact, in the dissertation, but not in the article, I examined the educational levels of the generations for each nationality to see to what extent that was associated with the differences and changes and generational differences of the European nationalities.
In their occupation scores.
And I used three measures of education: the percent who had less than 5 years of school, the percent who finished high school, and the percent who had 1 or more years of college.
Mm-hmm.
And these data were also standardized for age, the same age and urban rural residence
on that same calculator.
Same calculator. And the results showed that educational differences among the generations of nationalities were generally consistent with the occupational differences, although there were some exceptions. And so education has to be a main factor in that development.
Education as the great escalator in
Yes,
American
very
society.
much so.
If you want to rise up to the next floor, you get on the escalator.